So hello everyone. Today we are discussing about how does Bitcoin actually work, part 2. I hope you already watched the part 1 and liked that video a lot. If not, that video is a compulsory prerequisite to this one. And again, disclaimer for this video as well, like in the previous one, that this video is only for information purpose and this is not financial advice of any sort. So if you want to invest in Bitcoin or any other currency, do it at your own risk and at your own discretion. So in the last part, we reached a solution which was proposed by the original Bitcoin, understanding various levels of problems, and we understood the solution the original Bitcoin white paper gave was that we should trust the blocks with the most computational work. In this part, we will start and learn with what is computational work. So in our current protocol, from the last video, we learned that we need to broadcast our transactions on the entire network. We can only accept signed transactions. Nobody is allowed to overspend. So these three protocols were established pretty well in part 1. So if you are not clear with these, make sure you watch part 1 again. So now we are going to talk about the next step. So let's understand what computational work is. In very simple terms, it is some work that is put in to find a particular pattern. But let's start understanding what pattern do we have to find. So in case you would remember, in the last video we talked about a hash function in which we fed ID, message and the secret key of a user to generate a value of 256 digits, which was strictly 1 or 0, right? And this could reach up to 2 to the power 256 combinations. For again perspective how large this is, 2 raised to the power 30 is greater than 1 billion. So compared to this number astronomically large. So let's say this 256 digits are aligned like this together, and we have to find a pattern such that the first 30 digits are 0, right? Similarly, there could be another pattern that first 60 digits are 0. So we have to find a pattern like this from some information. So how will this work? So let's say this is our ledger and there are multiple transactions written on this, right? Each of these transactions is individually signed by this message and is put in here. So what this exact line contains, it contains the message and the digital signature which is generated for this particular message. So to understand it, let's draw our ledger here again. So let's say this ledger has particular number of lines which are transactions. These are all signed transactions, and let's say I want to generate a number over here. How will this number be generated? Let's understand. So basically what we have to do is that we have to pass all these transactions as a message. So this message is the culmination of all the transactions. Along with this, I want to send a particular number such that a particular pattern is generated. Let's say for this particular block, I say I want to generate a number whose first 30 digits are zeros. So I need to find such a number when coupled with this message will give us this required pattern. And this is exactly what computational work is. So how can we find this number? So let's talk about this number. So this finally hash function will generate some number of 256 digits. And the only way to find this number to generate a particular hash is only through hit and trial. So for 30, there has to be more than 2 raised to the power 30 combinations. That means somebody to find this particular number must have gone from at least 1 to billion numbers. Now this is what computational work is. This was only, and since this was a cryptographic hash function, we can never be sure what input will result into the desired output. So there is no other method other than hit and trial. So now you know what is computational work. Now let's understand the next important term, which is proof of work. So in the previous slide, we understood that we have to find a particular number, and coupled with messages, we pass it through the cryptographic hash function, it will generate a particular pattern. So this number itself is the proof of work, because this number is generated, and when coupled with this, it will always generate a number with 30 zeros in the beginning. That is the proof of work. That work has been done to find this number and to record those transactions. So if the required pattern is generated correctly, that is the proof of work. So now how does this solve our problem? So what we do, of all our transactions, we divide them into smaller blocks like this. And each block has its own proof of work. attached to it. This is some number. These are all transactions which are written in this individual block. And each block also has the hash of previous block. So this will be written here and this will be written here. So now effectively, this would mean that when we were talking about generating a hash function from message plus number, well, this is not entirely true. Function is given with hash of previous block along with the messages, which are basically transactions, along with the number to generate a new pattern or the required pattern. So this is how this solves a problem. But how? I'm claiming that this solves a problem, but even if the blocks have transactions, how does it exactly solve a problem? So first of all, as I mentioned, that this function is a cryptographic hash function. So let's say, for example, if it had the message cat and it generated some number of 256 digits, well, even a very slight change for making C to B as bad, this entire number will change very largely. So I can be sure that each block, when verified, has a large amount of work into it already, since it has its own proof of work. So if somebody decides to send a fraud transaction, let's say all these were legit transactions, but this particular transaction is a fraud transaction. Now this would mean that the hash of this block will change largely due to this one additional transaction into the ledger. As mentioned here also, if from cat we change it to bat, it will change largely. Imagine putting in an entire transaction which is signed. So that means now this particular block has to compete with all the other blocks that are being broadcasted worldwide. So let's say if A wants to fraud B with a particular transaction and he adds a transaction over here, while the other 26 people will also be broadcasting their ledgers and finding their own proof of work, A might get lucky once or twice, but he would have to beat them every single time to keep this block as relevant. And a block is only valid if it has its own proof of work, so it will be very tough for A to keep this up for very long. So basically there is no proof that this system entirely works, but the key feature is that you can prove that this does not fail. So let's see and understand how is it very tough to make this system fail. Let's say there's this ledger, right? And there are transactions, and this is a fraud transaction. So the hash of this block, which will be a number, will change because of this additional transaction, which would mean it will change the block here because it contains the hash of the previous block and it has some transactions, and hence it will change the next block. So this entire chain is now a different chain from the one that is being broadcasted by everyone. So the person who wants to create a fraud transaction is competing with the entire world to keep this block as relevant. And as the rule already stated, we have to keep the blocks with the most computational work. It's very unlikely that this person will get lucky every single time to find this proof of work before everyone else. A lot of systems in the real life as well depend on this. So for example, if you currently check the connection your browser is making with YouTube, you'll likely find SHA-256 written over there. This is the cryptographic hash function we've been talking about all along, which has the output of 256 characters. So even though there is no proof that this works, there is definitely proof that this system is not easy to fail, and hence it works on trust. So now what is a blockchain? So as we discussed that each transaction is divided into blocks which contains its own hash. The next block contains the hash of the previous block and its own number. The next one contains the hash of the previous block and contains its own number as well, and hence you can see this has become a chain of blocks, and hence this is a blockchain. So blockchain is essentially a collection of records which are linked with each other, cannot be altered. Let's understand this point. So let's say there are 3 blocks like this, each have their own transactions, each have their own proof of work, N1, N2 and N3, and since this is linked with each other, this will have N1, this is linked with each other, this will have N2. So if I change one transaction over here, that means my N1 will change. If N1 is changed, that means my N2 is changed because it is directly dependent upon N2. If N2 is changed, my N3 will be changed because it is directly dependent on N2. So on so forth, the entire chain will be disrupted. This is one case. In case I want to change the order of these blocks, that means my new blockchain will be, let's draw the new blockchain. If I alter these, so when I've altered this is now my new blocks. They have their own transactions, and this was N2, this was N1, this was N3. Now that means N1 will have to change because the hash of the previous function is now N2 instead of N0. So this will change and this will change, and the entire chain will have to alter, and hence it becomes very tough to alter a blockchain. And since all of these numbers themselves are all generated from a cryptographic hash function, they are all protected. So now let's understand some important concepts like what is mining. So when all of these transactions are broadcasted over the network, so people are basically competing with each other to find the proof of work. The proof of work is nothing but the number that was being put at the end of each block, right? This number is basically proof of work. So for somebody who's catching all these broadcasts and putting in all this computational work, he needs to be incentivized. So at the end of each block, he can add one line of transaction where this particular person gets some money. Once they find the block, they broadcast it over the network, and to reward themselves, this money is given to them. And this is called the block reward or mining. So why is block reward called mining? Because it takes a lot of work, we just learned, and it adds a new amount of currency into the economy. So that means somebody who's working on Bitcoin and finds the proof of work here, he's adding a line here that some additional Bitcoin is being offered to him, is being rewarded to him, and they are not just circulating, but this is being created out of thin air, and hence it adds new amount of currency to the economy. When you look at this entire system, this is basically a lottery, as in who will first find the proof of work or the right number before everyone else. So what are the basically consequences of mining? Number one, it is increasing the total amount of cryptocurrency in existence. We just learned that we are creating cryptocurrency as block rewards out of thin air. So unlike transactions, block is not signed, block is created. All those transactions broadcasted are heard on a single block, and they are getting recorded by a miner and getting attached with a hash number for security. When there are a lot of transactions that are being heard, they can choose what transaction to actually include and what not. So finally, after all this, what is our finally updated protocol for maintaining the updated ledger that we've been talking about since part 1? So we learned about that we have to we have to only accept signed transactions. Nobody is allowed to overspend. So these 3 things we learned about in part 1. In this part, we learned that if you hear 2 different blockchains, trust the one with the most computational one, and in this case it is the longest one. So let's say the first block comes, the second block comes, the third block comes. You are hearing this as one broadcast from some sources, and you are hearing another blockchain which has 4 blocks. So this means there's more computational work put in over here. This works because for somebody who's creating fraud transactions, he has to work on an entirely different blockchain, and there is no way that he can alone add more blocks than compared to the entire world itself, and hence we always trust the longest chain. So basically, if there is a tie, if there are 2 blockchains which are running simultaneously and having equal blocks, let's say the person who's broadcasting the fraud transaction got to this block earlier, and even the next block, that means he tied with the current longest chain. We have to wait until we hear additional blocks to verify which block is correct and which is incorrect. So this is our updated protocol. So how exactly is this system trustworthy? Because everyone is agreed on a fixed protocol, and hence there can be no discrepancy, and hence it is truly decentralized because there's no one central entity looking over it, but everyone has come to it from a general consensus. Everyone has their own copy of the blockchain, and to create fraudulent transactions, you have to beat the entire world. We just learned about this. To create a fraudulent transaction, you have to run your own chain and compete with the entire world, which is very tough. So, but wait, what if I simply don't broadcast my fraudulent transactions but send it to a single person I want to create a fraud against? Well, this won't work, since he will definitely be hearing the blocks that you are sending, but there's nothing to stop him from hearing the blocks that everyone else is sending. So if A wants to create a fraud against B and he sends him this particular block with the fraudulent transaction, B will definitely hear this chain, but he will also be hearing different blockchains from entire the world which are going to be longer than this particular chain, and hence he will follow the protocol and trust the longest chain, and hence this blockchain he will reject. So ultimately, to keep this fraudulent transaction as valid, he will also have to modify entire network, which is not going to be possible to compete and win against everyone. And in only case possible that A can keep up with this charade is that if he has at least more than 50% of computational power of the entire world. Because even if he wins this lottery for the first few blocks, doesn't mean he can win it for all the subsequent blocks. Eventually somebody else is going to win the lottery and beat him. So there you go. Now you know how Bitcoin works. But wait, this is not the entire thing. This is just the surface of it. This is just to understand it in very simple terms and not going into the depths of it. For example, Bitcoin doesn't follow a particular pattern of 30 zeros or even 60 zeros. It changes its pattern every few blocks. And when more and more miners are added, each block is created in roughly 10 minutes, and some other blockchains are definitely faster. Some more facts about Bitcoin. All of the money is created from the block reward, as we learned. The block reward is halved every 210,000 blocks, which is roughly every 4 years. Because it decreases geometrically, there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. So it started from 50 and it has been geometrically decreasing. So you can easily find online the current rate for mining. So if no new Bitcoin is generated after a few years, will the miners stop earning? Well, no. In addition to adding the block reward, miners can also charge some transaction fee for listening and approving transactions. Each block is only limited to 2400 transactions in Bitcoin. This slow speed might add the cost of transaction, since miners might have to choose between what transaction to include and which not to include. And miners can charge higher fees for including your particular transaction over somebody else's transaction in the blockchain. So because Bitcoin is limited only to 2400 transactions, it has been under some scrutiny because it reduces the speed massively. For comparison, you can look at speed at which Visa operates and you'll find that the speed that Bitcoin has is quite underwhelming. So I hope that you've liked the explanation today about Bitcoin and this and part 1 combined, and it cleared a lot of your doubts. So if you still have any doubt, make sure you comment them below. I'll be happy to take them. And if you did like this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and get to know when I come out with the next video about more Bitcoin facts. So thank you everyone for joining, and take care and stay safe.